Hello, everyone. I am Wes Purvis, and I'm going to talk about roaming today for 54 minutes and 40 seconds. So, roaming is a very important part of Wi-Fi, and I think is understood to some extent, but there have been some changes, I would say, or improvements that clients are now taking advantage of that we should all be aware of, and that's kind of the point of this presentation. So, there we go. Okay, so we all know how to design, right? Where you, when you do your design, you're thinking of, okay, let me think about my primary coverage, maybe my secondary coverage, and maybe you go on site and you do an AP on a stick to kind of, what is my overlap between between my access points? And the reason that you do that is clients use signal strength as a roaming indicator, right? They look at their signal strength and decide if they should roam to a new AP. So pretty standard. Secondary coverage, don't forget about that. Comes in handy. But now, how does 6 gigahertz come into the picture? Are there changes here that actually, that may make you think differently about how you design, how you implement? And I think probably yes. And so if we kind of look at, this is Apple documentation around how it performs a roam scan. And one of the things it says is, okay, you really probably want to use 11K because it narrows down the list of candidates or channels that the client needs to scan. But there's some language in here that if you don't have 11K enabled, then the client is going to scan all the channels. It doesn't know any better. And so if you think about, as you start to get into 6 gigahertz, and where there's a lot more channels, this becomes a lot more important. This idea of having a narrowed list of channels to scan. And so here's a little quiz. So 2.4, we have 3 channels. I know some people do 4 channels in Europe, but I'm going to say 3 channels. I'm curious, how many 5 gig channels in Europe? Because this has changed. How many channels? What is it? 24? That's a good guess. Okay, it's 24. So in the US, we have 25. Channel 144 is the difference. Anybody know the number of 20 megahertz 6 gig channels in Europe? It is also 24. That is a good guess. So there's a lot more channels now. If you think about the beginning, to the beginnings of Wi-Fi, when there weren't methods for telling clients where they should look, right? Clients could only rely upon off-channel scanning for determining if which AP they should move to. Now we have 48 additional channels that didn't exist 20 years ago. So the way that we think about roaming needs to change, and to the standards credits, they have, right? That has been thought of, and so there are mechanisms for helping clients roam. And so just if we think about some math, this is just some napkin math of how long would it take a client to scan every channel if it was just performing off-channel scanning. So if we look at all of the channels, so including all of the non-PSCs in 6 gigahertz, in Europe, it could take us over 6 seconds to scan every single channel. If we exclude the non-PSCs, so only our scanning PSCs, that drops to about 4 seconds across all the bands. But 4 seconds is a long time. That's too long. You would have probably a noticeable. Every time that you roam, you'd have something noticeable. Whether you're on a voice call, whether you're just doing normal email, your client would probably drop off or or have slowness. So that takes us to modern times. So let's talk about 6 gigahertz and the discovery mechanisms that come along with them. So not all of these are technically 6 gigahertz specific, but 6 gigahertz has kind of brought them all together and to a point where clients actually use them. 802.11k been around for several years, and we are largely to a point where 11k is enabled. You can enable and should enable 11k. There's really one client that I know of. There's probably more, but there's like a MediaTek client that really, with an old driver, just does not like 11k. But other than that, 11k is very good, very safe, and very helpful. Right? Most client devices actually call out 11k in their documentation, as you saw with Apple. Android does similar, Windows as well. So 11k, very useful, but it's also relevant for 6 gigahertz discovery. 6 gigahertz clients do 11k. The reduced neighbor report, which has also existed before 6 gigahertz, is heavily leveraged in 6 gigahertz, and I'll talk specifically about how how it can be used and how it is used. But there's a lot of, I think, the reduced neighbor report is something that everybody should understand and understand how their vendor implements the reduced neighbor report, because it varies, but there's a lot of power to it, and clients really seem to latch on to the RNR, and so it's been really good. Just from a discovery mechanism, you can put with the MB SSID, could just look at have one beacon and have multiple ESSIDs in there. There are passive mechanisms; those continue. So your off-channel scanning, probing, clients still probe in 6 gig. There are 2 other passive discovery mechanisms, the fast initial link setup or fills, and the unsolicited probe response, which these 2 I'm not really going to talk about because I don't think they're relevant. I don't think they really help anything. And where they are leveraged is like 6 gigahertz only SSIDs, but I just don't really, I don't think it's worth the overhead that it incurs. These things go out every 20 milliseconds versus a beacon every 100 milliseconds approximately. So does it really buy you all that much? Probably not. So let me go into the reduced neighbor report because there's a lot of really cool things here. So first is, what does it look like when a client discovers 6 gigahertz with RNR and without? So left is without the RNR. The right is with the RNR, and so if you maybe a little bit hard to see, but the client on the right has already joined the network and is able to ping. The client on the left is still waiting to join and has now joined. And so you go from generally a quick discovery less than 5 seconds to 20 to 30 seconds or more if clients even discover are discovering 6 gigahertz SSIDs. So the reduced neighbor report is the thing that clients use to discover 6 gigahertz. So keep that in mind. It's very important. And so I just want to I want to play a little bit of video. I won't play the whole thing of what does it look like when a client is roaming around. So the left is ping. The right is this is the new version of an oversight. It's with the new shortcut or capability in iOS 17 with ability to read the signal strength. So that's what's being kind of shown on the right. And so signal's going down. I'm walking around. Client will actually will roam at some point. Let me maybe fast forward. But the client is sticking to 6 gigahertz, right? Like that's kind of what you see with most clients. Most 6 gigahertz capable clients, they prefer 6 gigahertz. They stay on 6 gigahertz as you roam from AP to AP. And part of that is there's some channel bandwidth considerations that come into play, which I'll talk about later. But by and large, 6 gig clients connect to 6 gig and they roam. And this is largely thanks to the reduced neighbor report and the other mechanisms which I'll talk about. So everything all comes together and really helps clients roam. So client channel 85. Neg 56. So I won't bore you with the rest of the video, but it's client roams. It stayed on 6 gig, and signal strengths are reasonable. So what are a couple? When you think about the reduced neighbor report, right? This is an information element in the beacon or in probe responses, and the way that you can configure an RNR. You have a lot of flexibility with. So, one common scenario is, like, let's say I have a single SSID. It's a multi-band SSID, whether it's 2456, 56, whatever it is, multi-band SSID. In the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz beacons, you would put in the RNR element, you would put the 6 gigahertz BSSID and channel information. And so that way, as a client, I see that and say, oh, there's a 6 gigahertz BSSID on channel 85. Let me go look on that. And I'll probably still do a probe, right? This doesn't replace the probe, because I want to validate that, hey, that client or that AP is actually there, right? And it's at a reasonable signal strength for me. So I'm gonna look at that that beacon with the RNR. And if I have 10 APs or 5 APs that I can see, okay, I just got 5 candidate 6 gig APs. Great. And instead of needing to scan 24 channels, I just go to 5. So it's it's pretty slick, when you think about it. And so this is kind of the most simple example of how how an RNR is used, and I think pretty much any vendor will do this. Another scenario would be like if you had multiple SSIDs. So let's say, my first SSID I have as 2.4 or 5 or no 6 gig on it, and then I have a 6 gigahertz only second SSID. In that case, it's exactly the same. On the 2.4.5 SSID, I put in the RNR element, I put the 6 gigahertz BSSID. No different, right? It's 2 SSIDs, but conceptually, I'm advertising the 6 gig capability on 2.4.5. Now, there are many different permutations to this. Now, like most people have more than 2 SSIDs, they may have 3, 4, 5, and so I'll speak to what we do at my company, which is we make sure that the 6 gig BSSID, the 6 gig SSID is always in at least one 2.4.5 beacon, right? It's always somebody can always discover it. Now, you can start to do some other cool things. So I don't necessarily have to put the RNR for my same AP. I can put the RNR in the RNR. I can have multiple APs. And I can have, which means I can have like my neighbor APs. So when you think about what we do with 11K, this starts to sound really similar. So in an example where I have, let's say, 3 APs, on AP1, in my RNR, I can put AP2 and 3. In AP2, I can put in the RNR, I can put AP1, AP3, and then AP3, I can put AP1 and AP2. So with this, now I just one beacon, I have 3 candidate APs and 3 channels to go to. And this is really good, especially if you can kind of intelligently do this and you're actually putting kind of useful neighbor or candidates in there. It can be a really good shortcut. So like as I'm walking around, think about what the client has to do. So like I've walked into a building, I've discovered that there's 6 gigahertz, great, and I've connected. I walk. Oh, my signal's getting low. Where do I go next? Right? So every time the client roams, it has to think about where it's going next. And so it's not like a one-time problem. So the client needs it constantly needs new candidate information. And so the R&R is one way that it can get that candidate information, but it's really useful, and especially because clients seem to have implemented it, which is a challenge in a lot of cases for other technologies. But the R&R, we've kind of proved is heavily used, and so it kind of expanding the number of APs that you're putting in the R&R is useful. So what does that actually kind of look like? So here is I think this is actually a probe response, but it would look the same in a beacon. So there's actually 3 neighbor APs in here. And so we got 1, 2, and 3. And I've expanded some of the elements in here. And so the next thing to look at is, okay, each one of these neighbor APs has a channel and an operating class. It's hard to see, but it says channel and it says operating class. And so the channel gives you the actual channel number. The operating class is the band and the bandwidth. And the other thing is you'll also see a BSSID in here. And that BSSID is the BSSID of the 6 gig BSSID for that, whatever is in here. Now I didn't expand everything else. There's other information, but this is kind of the basics. This is some of what the client looks at and says, oh great, okay, I know the channel, and let me go look for it. Let me go make sure it's there and see if I want to connect to it. So operating class, you can look this up in the spec, but instead of putting the band, because there's now a lot of channel and band permutations, this concept of an operating class is used. And so the 6 gig operating classes are 131 through 134. There's actually a few more, but these are the important ones. So 133 is 6 gig, 80 megahertz. So if you see 133, which was on, should have been on my previous, in here, you'll see, here's 133. That means 6 gig, 80 megahertz. And so you'll see this this operating class in several IEs in the beacon. It's not just not just in one place, but there's a operating class IE. There's a channel report IE in the R&R. You'll see it. So you'll see operating class all over. If you're not familiar, these are the common ones. So next thing is. It's also important, so with the ability to put neighbor APs in my R&R, that aren't me, like as an AP, there's other APs in there. I need to distinguish if this AP is co-located or not. Co-located meaning it's in the same AP. And the reason for this, think about, again, as the client, I'm walking around, I listen to this beacon or I get a probe response and it has multiple APs in the R&R. I want to know which is the one that is that I'm hearing right now, right? Because I can make different decisions if it's not a co-located AP, that it's probably a little bit further away. I may check that one second or third versus I'll check the one that's co-located first and see if that's actually the best candidate for me. And there's a couple other fields in here, like same SSID, but there's actually a decent amount of information that clients can use to make decisions. Now, if they do, I don't know, but co-located for sure is an important one. Okay, so that's R&R. I think R&R is the most important discovery mechanism for 6 gig clients, but the things that we're used to from previous generations of Wi-Fi still exist and are still very relevant. So probes, yes, clients probe in 6 gigahertz, and they even probe on non-PSCs, which, depending on what you look, it may or may not be supposed to happen, but clients do probe on non-PSCs. And so, there's a lot of probes that go out. Now, the difference in a between a 5 gig probe and a 6 gig probe is you can't send a wildcard probe request, right? So you still send a broadcast, but your SSID field can't be wildcard. It has to have a value in it. Whether it's the short SSID or the full SSID doesn't matter, but you have to have an SSID value in there to probe, which in some ways helps reduce kind of okay, let me just send this out and everybody on channel responds, which tends to eat up a lot of airtime. So yeah, probes are still useful and necessary, and usually what you see is before the client connects to an AP, it will probe, right? Because it's done out-of-band discovery, it knows that this AP should exist, and it wants to make sure it does exist and it's at a good signal strength or acceptable signal strength. So most commonly, you'll see, if you do a multi-channel capture, you'll see the client is probing on a few select channels, just to kind of confirm that this is the AP I want to connect to, and then it initiates its authentication association. 11K is also still very relevant for 6 gigahertz. So clients, they learn neighbor APs from the beacons and probe responses, but they can also learn the neighbor APs in the exact same format from the 11K neighbor response. And so usually most clients nowadays, the big guys, right? The Intels, the Apples, the Androids, they almost all do a neighbor report request and response immediately following association. And now the downside of that, and one pitfall is, okay, that's at the beginning of the association. So again, if I've walked, that list may be out of date. So that's where the beacon and the probe response with the RNR is super useful, because, okay, I've walked, now I have an updated list with signal strengths. Another thing that is helpful, and some vendors do this, not all, but in 6 gig, you may see some beacons on unexpected channels. And this is because, so in this example, I have an AP, it's configured on channel 117, 80 megahertz. If you look in any tool, it'll tell you channel 117, 80 megahertz. But if you do a packet capture, this packet capture is taken on channel 125, which is a secondary 20 megahertz channel. In that bonded channel set, I see a beacon. So this is a duplicate beacon sent on each 20 megahertz channel. And the value that I see here is, in the event that I'm using non-PSCs, I still have a beacon, I still have RNR information coming on like on a PSC, for example. Because if I use a non-PSC as primary, there will be a PSC, depending on my channel bandwidth, in there somewhere. And so, yeah, this is just another thing that I think is helpful for clients, because it lets the client know that, yep, something is there. So a question that or an idea that I've seen come up a lot is this idea of a 6 gigahertz only SSID. So as you start thinking about your SSID strategies, one idea, and there's a couple of permutations of this, but like one is 6 gig only SSID. I still have 5 gig on the AP. Right? I think that's the most common, and I showed that, yeah, that'll work kind of just fine. But this is like 6 gig only, no 5 gig, no 2.4 on the AP. And yeah, exactly. I don't know why this keeps coming up, but it keeps coming up. And so I did some testing to see what happens. And so to the client devices like credit, there have been a lot of improvements to 6 gigahertz discovery in the past 12 months. Even the past 6 months, when I talked at WLPC in Phoenix, there's been a lot of improvements. So iOS 17 and the latest Mac OS now discover 6 gig only SSIDs that have no 245 assistance, if you give them long enough. Previously, like iOS 16 and previous Mac OS did not. They would just simply would not see them. Android seems to be hit or miss. Usually it'll discover it. And same on Windows. They will usually discover it as well, but it may take a little bit of time. But there have been improvements, and I think there will continue to be improvements to optimize kind of discovery with so many more channels now. So here's a test I did where on the left I have 5 and 6 gig enabled, and on the right I have 6 gig only enabled, no 245. And so what you'll see is, so the area to look is you got the channel and BSSID and signal strength. So look there. They're pretty close to synchronized. So as I'm walking, and I went to an area in a building where, like, into a new room, and so there was a steep drop off in signal, and so on the left I kind of get to neg 75, and then boom, I roam. On the right, I'm at neg 80, neg 85, still waiting, still waiting, still waiting, still waiting, and then I roamed. So yes, you probably can do it, but should you? Probably not. Like the other mechanisms that I discovered, like that I talked about, so the 11K, you can actually, in the 6 gig beacon, you can put an R&R, and that also helps. Helps you find your next AP, right? You have to find the first one, and then you can look at that 6 gig R&R and see, okay, this may be a neighbor AP that I look at. So it potentially is possible, but you just have slower discovery. You're going to have a worse overall roaming experience, and so not recommended. And so I would say, if you think about your SSID strategy, in most cases you should, you may want to think about a 5 plus 6 gig SSID, because that gives the client somewhere to fall back to should they have a discovery issue. It's not, you can do 6 gig only with 245 assistance, but why just do, you can pretty easily add a 5 gig SSID, and you've added a bit of redundancy, so to speak, for client discovery. Next is the PSC versus non-PSC discussion. So if you look at my presentation or pretty much any vendor documentation on 6 gigahertz, the recommendation is to use PSCs strictly. That's all you should do. If you use non-PSCs, your network will burn down. So, and that's because at the time of the recommendation, there weren't, we didn't have a full client ecosystem. We didn't have, the iOS, we didn't have the Mac OS. We had Android, we had Windows, but we didn't fully know what the client ecosystem and client behavior was going to be like. We now have that. So let me talk a little bit about what our experience has been with using non-PSCs. So to set the context, usually I think most guys can do. You can actually use non-PSCs, but you may have to configure that. Like the default is to use PSCs, and so in Mist, you just enable all the channels by default. RRM uses the PSCs. So in June in the UK, we did an event with AWS. There's a AWS Summit. We used our external 6 gig AP, the AP45E, which is legal in Europe. You can use under low power rules. And so this was a really good test for 6 gigahertz. So the first thing was over 10% of clients connected on 6 gig. which was a bit of a shock to me, because previously, I think the highest I had seen was 5%, maybe 3%, is most typical. And this was, granted, this was in June. But so out of 10,000 clients connected, 11,000-ish connected concurrently, over 10% connected 6 gig. And so this was really cool, really encouraging to see. Out of this, we got a lot of 6 gig data. So the first is, this is the number of associations ranked by channel in the 6 gig band. So the left is the channel, and the right is the number of associations. So at the top, that channel had the most amount of associations. At this event, it was in Europe, high density, we used 40 megahertz channels. Which means, we had a choice of, okay, we only use the PSCs, or, that essentially means that we have half the available channels. So, decision was made, let's use non-PSCs. And so what happened? Did clients connect to these non-PSCs, or did the network burn down? The non-PSCs are highlighted in yellow. I think it's safe to say the PSC versus non-PSC discussion is sort of past us. You can use non-PSCs. And we have another number of customers who use non-PSCs, and in testing ourselves as well. So I feel very good about using non-PSCs. We are changing our recommendations to say, yeah, go ahead, use non-PSCs. And especially if you have 5 gig to fall back to, the worst that happens is the client doesn't discover that particular AP. Not a big deal, really. So yeah, non-PSCs should feel good about, and I think that's good news, especially in Europe, where there's half the number of channels as other places in the world, and so where 40 megahertz is probably a more realistic channel bandwidth to use in 6 gigahertz versus 80 megahertz, which can be used in other areas. Now, how about the roaming affinity? This is a just an example client, and I think this is pretty typical. It may actually be a little bit worse than typical in terms of 5 gig versus 6 gig affinity. So the area that you want to look is kind of right here. This column is the band that the client roamed to. So this is each roam event. And when it's highlighted, it means that the client changed band from the previous AP that it was connected to. And so most of these say 6 gigahertz. And then there's a couple band flops, which I think is par for the course to be expected. But in general, clients prefer 6 gig. If you're a 6 gig capable client, you're probably connecting on 6 gig, especially if you use a wider channel bandwidth in 5 gig in 6 gig than 5 gig. So, and let me lead into that channel bandwidth discussion a little bit. So what happens, when I'm roaming around, I get to my signal threshold and I want to roam. And I scan, or I use the out-of-band discovery mechanisms, and there's 3 APs that meet my signal criteria, right? I have 3 APs greater than -67, or whatever it is. Which one do I choose? How do I break that tie? So it turns out that all of the client guys, they use signal as they use signal as okay, to decide if I'm going to roam. One of the things they use, right? There can also be times where channel utilization is so high. Let me look around, see if there's a better AP. But by and large, I use signal. I decide if I'm going to roam, and then usually there's going to be multiple acceptable candidate APs, so I have to do a tiebreaker. The tiebreaker is usually a throughput calculation. So the client is looking at all sorts of metrics. It's looking at what is the channel width, what's the channel utilization, spatial streams on the AP. This is Android, and so it calculates a throughput metric, and then makes this determination. And this is relevant because how do you get a higher throughput metric? Well, increase your channel bandwidth. And it's very similar on iOS as well. They don't call out as neatly that they're doing a throughput calculation, but they're doing a throughput calculation. And I can guarantee there are things in here that they're looking at that are not actually mentioned. So you have this 80 megahertz preferred over 40 megahertz, preferred over 20 megahertz, 11AX preferred over AC over 11N, and it actually does call out that there's channel utilization and quality, the number of connected clients also considered, as part of the tiebreaker. An interesting thing that I found in here that I thought was interesting was generally they're using data packets for determining RSSI. So when I'm connected to an AP, I'm going to use the data packets to look at RSSI versus beacons, which makes a lot of sense. And then I'm not connected to my next AP, so I need to use the beacon for that until I connect, and then I can use data frames to look at RSSI. So because there's this throughput metric, I want to talk a little bit about channel bandwidth. So here's a floor plan. AP is on a floor plan. And so one thing that we have seen from questions I get from customers is, hey, I have a conference room that is heavily utilized. Can I just do 40 megahertz in there and 20 megahertz everywhere else? And the answer is maybe not. Because clients are doing this throughput calculation, they tend to stick when you have a 40 megahertz channel just on one AP and 20 megahertz everywhere else. So that's not usually recommended. You usually want to do the same channel bandwidth in a particular area, usually on the same floor, or maybe just in contiguous RF area. And so here's just an example question.
If you have, I have pretty often a company which has an office area
Yeah.
and a warehouse. Normally I would do there in the warehouse 20 megahertz channel because channels do not support more, and 40 megahertz just for the office area. So I wouldn't see that you have always a situation you can combine.
Yeah. Yeah, so the comment was in mixed-use environments like a warehouse or a office environment, in the warehouse you may do 20 megahertz, in the office you may do 40 megahertz. And yeah, that is okay because there's usually, you may have RF neighborship, but there's a defined kind of line there. So that kind of thing is okay usually in many cases. But it's where you have I'm in a area where I could reasonably expect to roam between, and I have a anomalous channel bandwidth. That's when you're going to see stickiness. So here's an example where two APs next to each other, they're 10 feet apart, and actually when I did the test, I kind of walked into a room and I had the 20 megahertz AP closer. So a couple dB better than the 40 megahertz AP, and I tried to make it as unfair as I could. Well, actually, they're both on. In this screenshot, I have them both on DFS channels, but I also did a test where I put the 40 megahertz on DFS channel in 5 gig and the 20 megahertz on a non-DFS channel, which usually you discover a non-DFS channel better. In this example, and this isn't contrived. I turned off the Wi-Fi, turned on, and also walked into the room. I did both tests, and I would say 95% of the time, every client connected to the 40 megahertz AP over the 20 megahertz. And this is with Windows, this is with Android, this is with iOS and Mac OS. So this is kind of like a real consideration that you think about because. And we've had several customers who have, they've wanted to kind of, the 40 megahertz channel is is enticing because it increases your maximum channel bandwidth, but it usually comes with, with some trade-offs. Now, can you actually get a client to prefer 6 gigahertz? Prefer 5 gigahertz over 6 gigahertz? Because most clients have a natural preference to 6 gigahertz. Part of it is the channel bandwidth. The other part of it is part of the logic is 6 gig over 5 gig. There's kind of like an artificial boost. So the answer is yes, you can actually. So if you were to configure 80 megahertz in 5 gig and 20 megahertz in 6 gig, then the clients prefer 5 gig. So in the again, look at this column. So here's the previous association connected on 6 gig, and then as soon as I change to 20 megahertz on 6 gig, connect on 5 gig and walked around, client stayed on 5 gig. So this may be useful. I don't know. People do weird things, have weird use cases. But yes, you can actually get clients to prefer 5 gig. Now, how about the more realistic scenario where you may have similar channel bandwidth for between 5 gig and 6 gig? So when you have wider channels between, 6 gig is wider than 5 gig, you'll get very good clients just prefer 6 gig. When you have the same channel bandwidth, so that's the bottom here, where both 5 gig is at 40 megahertz and 6 gig is at 40 megahertz, then you still get preference to 6 gig is what I've seen, but you may see more band switching, more interband roams. Okay, now another consideration of this roaming stuff is the client is making its roaming decision based on how it hears the AP, right? But in some cases, the client transmit power is lower than the AP transmit power. And this is especially true in 6 gigahertz where there's regulatory limits on the client transmit power. So here is a nice chart that Peter McKenzie put together that very neatly and succinctly calls out the transmit powers in various regulatory domains. And so the things to point out in here, so in Europe and UK, similar, not the same, but similar transmit powers. But you have a transmit power limit, EIRP limit. You also have a power spectral density, or PSD limit. And this PSD is the density of power over the frequency. So if you have a very narrow bandwidth, your density of power is higher, therefore you're going to hit that PSD limit. So your actual transmit power will need to be lower. Whereas wider channels, my density is lower, and so I can actually increase my overall transmit power to get to the PSD limit. So in the US, the client limit for a low power client is -1 dBm per megahertz. In Europe, for both APs and clients, it's 10 dBm per megahertz and 23 dBm EIRP. In UK, it's 12 dBm per megahertz, 24 dBm EIRP. So in the US, we're actually pretty handicapped on the client side. And what you'll see is a large differential between the AP's transmit power and the client, how the client hears the AP and how the AP hears the client. You'll see a differential. And so what I was curious of is that same thing in Europe. And so I hadn't actually been able to test it. So I did some testing in the US, and yes, you have clear difference, right? So if you look at 5 gig uplink to 5 gig downlink, the signal strength is very similar. So in this example, it's like -49 to -50. But if you look at the second and fourth rows, 6 gig AP to client and 6 gig client to AP, there's about 10 dB of difference there. And this makes sense when you look at when you actually look at the regulatory reports and the transfer powers that the clients are using. So the -1 dBm per megahertz, the 10 dBm per megahertz, those are the limits. clients don't actually go to the limit, APs don't actually go to the limit. You have to have margin because there's penalties if you exceed the limit. So there's usually at least 1 to 2 dB of margin. So this -1 is really like -2 or -3 in practice, like in actuality, most clients. So one thing I was curious of is, each client device has a home regulatory domain, right? Like your device is, when you set it up, you set your country. That's one thing. And then the other thing is clients often can learn their regulatory domain where they currently are from GPS location and also from the country code set in the beacons. So I was curious, with client devices from around the world, would they actually have a similar transfer power based on the regulatory domain that they're in? So last night, after the deep dives, a few of us happened to have iPhone 15s Pros. And so here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 iPhone 15s Pros in here and 1 Samsung Raymond's. And so what I take away from here is, so the black line is the S21, the colored lines are iPhone 15 Pros. So there's one client in here that kind of anomalous that has had maybe a couple dB higher transfer power than the rest. And that could have just been positioning, we didn't collect a lot of data points. But the other 4 devices are within a dB or 2 dBs of each other. And so I had my iPhone from the US. There are some phones from the UK. There are some from the EU, and yes, they do follow. They do seem to follow the regulatory domain that they're in, and you can actually see similar transfer power. So that's encouraging and good to verify. So the next thing to look at is, okay, what is the actual uplink downlink disparity in this is testing we again did last night, so in Europe. And so what I saw is with an AP configured to 20 dBm EIRP, I actually have very similar link quality between downlink and uplink. So the left is a packet capture from the AP. This is how the AP hears the client. So in the neg 67 range, neg 66 range. And then on the right is the wireless diagnostics from on iOS, and that's neg 67. So very similar transfer powers here, where when I do that same test in the US, I have 10 dB of difference. So you guys should feel good in Europe. This client transfer power restriction is not as relevant in Europe. Okay, and the last thing that I want to talk about, just in the scope of roaming, is 802.11r, and specifically 802.11r with an SAE or personal security type. I think we all understand the benefits of 11r for 802.1x radius, where you're saving the time of the radius transaction. But for like WPA2 PSK, we could do 11r, but really you probably never turned it on. One, because there's many clients didn't support it, and 2, did it really buy you anything? So I was curious, does it actually buy anything with WPA3? So the answer is yeah. There's some difference. So a WPA3 SAE roam, you have to do the commit confirm stuff, and then you do your 4-way handshake. So there's was 8-10 frames here versus 4 frames for an FT roam. So you're saving on the number of packets, and you don't have to do the key calculations. So this isn't scientific by any means, but I did probably a dozen or 2 dozen roams, and average roam time of a non-11R roam was 126 milliseconds. A average roam time of an 11R roam was 52 milliseconds. In the scheme of things, I think you're still probably okay without 11R, but there is 50 milliseconds of difference there. So in some environments that may be useful if the clients are to support it, and likely if they support WPA3, they do support 11R. So with that, let me just wrap it up and say, Wi-Fi has evolved, it's expanded, we have more channels, and our client, our channel and roaming discovery mechanisms should change as well. And the standard has actually done, I think, a very good job of keeping, giving us tools and mechanisms so that clients can roam well. Now, I would say there's a gap where, yes, some of these things existed, but largely they weren't implemented. 11K didn't come to the MacBook until the Apple Silicon Macs, right? So it's taken a little bit of time, but 6 gigahertz I think has forced the issue on many clients, because if you don't have these out-of-band discovery mechanisms, you just simply can't perform in 6 gigahertz. You won't roam very well, and so because of that, we should all be aware that these things exist and kind of how they work, especially the RNR. I think the RNR is kind of the biggest and most important thing, and is really helpful for 6 gig roaming. So with that, I am done.